One evening, as he prepared to leave, he passed the boardroom again. The door stood open. Inside, a meeting was underway, but the tone was different, thoughtful, slower. Respectful, no one argued loudly. He continued walking. At the building entrance, he paused and looked out at the city. The same city that once felt overwhelming now felt familiar. Even kind, he realized something important then he hadn't reclaimed. His old life, he had built a better one, and that was enough. The years that followed did not come with headlines or applause. They came quietly, the way real change often does. Mornings still began early for him, not because he had to, but because he liked the calm before the city fully woke. He enjoyed those hours when thoughts were clear and the world felt honest. His role stayed steady. He reviewed plans, asked careful questions, and helped teams slow down before rushing into decisions they would later regret. Sometimes people listened right away. Sometimes they didn't. Either way, he stayed patient. He had learned that influence did not always show itself immediately. One afternoon, the building lost power for a short while. Elevators stopped. Screens went dark. People stood around unsure of what to do next. It reminded him of another time, long ago, when everything felt frozen and uncertain. But something was different now. Instead of panic, there was cooperation. People talked to each other, shared updates, offered help. Temporary discomfort didn't turn into blame. He watched quietly from the side, noticing how far things had come. Later that same day, he found himself standing near the service hallway again, the place where it all began. The floor had been renovated, the walls freshly painted, but the space felt familiar. He smiled at the thought. Not because he missed those days, but because he honored them. A new janitor pushed a cart past him, eyes lowered, moving quickly. Something about the scene stopped him. He remembered how unseen he once felt in that exact position. He greeted the worker warmly. The smile he got back was surprised and grateful. It was a small moment, but small moments had meaning. At home, life remained simple. His apartment didn't change much. Same furniture. Same window facing the street. He liked knowing that happiness didn't require constant upgrades. Occasionally, old contacts reached out, curious, some respectful, some awkward. He didn't chase reconnections. He responded when it felt right and declined when it did. Peace had taught him how to choose. One rainy evening, he opened a notebook he rarely used. Inside were notes written years ago, early warnings, draft ideas. Mistakes he once thought defined him. He read through them slowly. Instead of regret, he felt clarity. Those pages were not proof of failure. They were proof of growth. At work, leadership shifted again as time passed. New faces appeared, younger ones. People with ideas and energy, but also questions. More questions than before. He made space for them. He shared lessons without preaching. Stories without bitterness. He explained how ignoring quiet voices often led to loud consequences. They listened. That mattered more than titles ever could. One day, during a meeting, someone referenced the incident from years ago without dramatizing it. Just a reminder of why the company paused instead of rushing. No one laughed. No. One dismissed it. The silence that followed was thoughtful, not uncomfortable. He knew then that the lesson had survived him. Late one evening, as he prepared to leave, he took the elevator down alone. The lights reflected softly off the mirrored walls. He looked at himself older now, calmer. He remembered the man he used to be, the one who thought certainty defined strength. He had learned otherwise. Strength lived in listening, in timing, in knowing when to speak and when to let others find their way. As he stepped outside, a cool breeze brushed past him. The city lights reflected on wet pavement, turning the street into a mirror of quiet movement. He breathed deeply. There were no regrets waiting for him anymore, only understanding. The boardroom still existed. Decisions were still made. Mistakes would still happen, but silence was no longer the default, and that he knew was enough. The invitation arrived without urgency. No bold subject line. No pressure to respond quickly. Just an honest request to attend a gathering in the same building where so much had changed. It was described as a conversation, not a celebration. He read the message twice and set it aside. For the rest of the day, he moved through his work with a familiar calm. He didn't hurry his steps or slow them. He listened, asked questions, and finished notes before leaving. When evening came, he accepted the invitation. The room was smaller than the boardroom, arranged simply. Chairs in a wide circle, water on a side table, soft light through tall windows. The city outside looked quieter at this hour, like it was holding its breath. People arrived one by one. Some he knew well. Others he had seen only in passing. A few recognized him with a nod that carried more respect than words. When everyone was seated, there was a moment of silence. Not awkward. Not forced. Just present. Someone spoke first. They talked about lessons learned and mistakes corrected. About how a culture could change when courage replaced habit. They spoke plainly, careful not to turn the moment into praise. Then they asked him to share a final thought. He stood slowly, not because his body needed time, because his words did. I don't think moments like this belong to one person, he said. They belong to everyone who chooses truth when silence feels easier. He paused and looked around the circle. I stood outside a room once with a cart and a choice, he continued. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I didn't want regret. No one interrupted. He spoke about timing. About how truth matters most when it's inconvenient. About how attention should never be tied to titles. When he finished, there was no applause. Instead, there were thoughtful faces and quiet agreement. Afterward, conversations flowed naturally. Some people shared how the changes had affected their teams. Others admitted how difficult it had been to question old habits. He listened more than he spoke. Later that night, as he walked toward the exit, someone stopped him. Older, tired eyes. A familiar seriousness. I didn't listen back then, the person said. I should have. He nodded. You're listening now. That seemed to be enough. Outside, the night air felt cool and clean. He stood for a moment, watching lights flicker on across nearby buildings. The next morning, he followed his usual routine. No speeches. No recognition waiting at his desk. Just work that mattered. Weeks passed. A policy he had helped shape prevented a rushed decision. A quiet review saved a team from a painful setback. These moments didn't make noise, but they mattered deeply to the people involved. He understood then that impact didn't need witnesses. One afternoon, a young employee asked him if speaking up ever stopped being hard. He smiled lightly. No, he said, but it gets worth it. As seasons changed, he noticed how the building itself seemed different. Not warmer or brighter, just more honest. Problems surfaced sooner. Meetings ended with clearer direction. Silence still happened. But it wasn't fear. It was thinking. On his final day before a long-planned break, he packed his desk carefully. A notebook. A pen. A small photograph of the city at dawn. He paused and looked around the room. He didn't feel like he was leaving something. Behind, he felt like he was letting something continue as he stepped into the hallway. He caught his reflection in a glass wall. Not the man with the cart. Not the man who fell. Just a person who chose to speak and kept choosing it. The elevator doors closed softly. The building carried on. So did the lesson. The building stood tall against the early morning sky, all glass and steel, catching the first light of the day. Inside, the upper floors were already alive. On one of the highest levels, a long boardroom table stretched beneath bright ceiling lights. Leather chairs were filled with people in sharp suits, their faces serious, their voices firm. Papers were spread out, screens glowed with charts, and every minute felt expensive. They were here to make decisions. Big ones. Numbers flashed on the screen at the front of the room. Profits, losses, forecasts, and risks. Some spoke with confidence. others with quiet pressure in their voices. There was an unspoken rule in this room: no mistakes, no weakness, no hesitation. Outside these glass walls, the world did not matter. Down the hall, far from the center of attention, a janitor pushed his cleaning cart slowly across the polished floor. The wheels made a soft sound that blended into the hum of the building. He moved carefully, like someone who did not wish to be noticed. Most people never looked at him. To them, he was just part of the background, like the lights or the walls. He had been working in this building for several years. Night shifts, mostly. Early mornings like this one, when offices were quiet. He cleaned spills, emptied trash bins, and wiped fingerprints from doors. It was honest work, even if most people did not think much of it. He wore a plain uniform, neat but simple, comfortable shoes that had seen long hours. As he approached the boardroom door, he slowed down. Not because of the work, but because of the voices. The door was not fully closed. From inside came raised tones and sharp words, followed by sudden pauses. This was not the usual calm meeting sound. Something important was happening. He pretended to focus on wiping the nearby wall, but his ears paid attention. Words drifted out through the doorway. Numbers, dates, company names. At first they meant nothing to him. Just business talk. He had learned to ignore this kind of thing over the years. Then he heard a phrase that made his hand pause in midair. It was a project name, one he had not heard spoken out loud in a very long time. His chest tightened slightly. He told himself it was just a coincidence. Big companies reuse names all the time. He wiped the wall again, slower now, listening despite himself. Another voice spoke, calm but firm. It mentioned an agreement signed years ago. The timing was clear. The details were too exact to be random. The janitor lowered his cleaning cloth. His eyes stared at the reflection of the glass wall in front of him, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Memories he had locked away began pushing forward. Years ago, he had worn a suit like the ones inside that room. He had sat at tables like that. He had been part of meetings where numbers decided people's lives. Back then, he believed in the system. He believed that hard work and honesty were enough. That belief did not survive a bad decision. Then a worse one. Finally, a betrayal he never saw coming. Documents twisted. Blame shifted. Powerful people protected themselves. When everything collapsed, he was left standing alone, holding the weight of it all. The fall had been fast. One day he had an office. The next, everything he built was gone. Friends stopped calling. Doors that once opened easily stayed closed. His name became something others avoided. Starting over was not easy. Pride had burned away bit by bit. He learned how to keep his head down, how to survive without being seen. This job cleaning offices for people who never knew his story was not what he once imagined for his life. But it paid the bills. It gave him quiet. He had made peace with that. Or at least, he thought he had. Inside the boardroom, the discussion heated up. Someone slammed a hand on the table. Another voice pushed back. The screen changed slides quickly, showing future profits tied to the very project name stuck in the janitor's mind. He stepped closer to the door. Still unnoticed. No one inside looked his way. To them, he was invisible. As he listened, something became clear. The plan being discussed was not just risky, it was built on missing information. Critical information, he recognized it because he had once worked on something similar. He knew the cracks hidden beneath the surface. He knew the clause no one ever liked to talk about. The one that could destroy everything if ignored. His throat felt dry. His heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from the heavy feeling of responsibility. He told himself to walk away. This was not his world anymore. These people would never listen to someone pushing a cleaning cart. Even if they did, why would they believe him? Speaking up could cost him his job. Silence was safer, but another memory surfaced. A moment from long ago when he had stayed quiet instead of fighting back. That silence had cost him more than any risk ever did. The voices inside began to settle. Decisions were being formed. Votes would follow soon. Once that happened, it would be too late. He glanced at his reflection in the glass. The face looking back at him was older, lined by time and experience. But the eyes were sharp, observant, alive. He took a slow breath and gripped the handle of his cart. Inside the room, someone joked lightly, breaking the tension. Laughter followed, the kind of laugh that came from power and comfort. Untouched by consequences, the janitor stood still in the hallway. Caught between the past he escaped and the future unfolding just feet away. For a moment, the building felt completely silent, as if waiting. He did not move yet. Not today. Not here, but something had already shifted. The story had begun. The janitor moved his cart away from the boardroom door, but his mind stayed inside that room. As he walked down the hallway, the polished floor reflected the ceiling lights, stretching endlessly ahead of him. Every step felt heavier than the last. The voices he had overheard kept replaying in his head. Mixing with memories he had worked hard to forget, he stopped near a quiet corner and leaned lightly against the wall. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He told himself to breathe. This was just another day, just another building, just another meeting he had no place in. That had been his life now, simple, predictable. But his thoughts refused to settle. He remembered long nights from years ago. Sitting in his office with papers spread everywhere, coffee gone cold, trying to make sense of numbers that never fully lined up. Back then, he had trusted others too easily. He believed that people at the top wanted the same things he did: stability, fairness, and long-term success. He had been wrong. The project name he heard that morning was not just familiar, it was personal. It was connected to a decision that had changed his life. A rushed agreement pushed through under pressure. A warning he had raised that was quietly ignored. And when things began to fall apart, blame had landed on the one person least able to fight back. Him. He opened his eyes and looked around the empty hallway. The building smelled faintly of cleaner and fresh coffee, drifting up from lower floors. Somewhere nearby, an elevator chimed softly. Life continued, unaware of the thoughts weighing him down. He resumed his work. Wiping door handles and straightening chairs in nearby conference rooms, his hands moved automatically, muscle memory guiding every motion. Yet his attention drifted back again and again to the boardroom above. Inside that room, votes would soon be cast. Decisions would be stamped as final. Once that happened, consequences would reach far beyond those walls. People would lose jobs. Careers would be tied to a plan built on shaky ground. He knew what happened when early warnings were ignored. He had lived it. He paused beside a window overlooking the city. Cars moved like small dots below. From up here, everything looked distant and calm. It reminded him of how easily those at the top forgot the real impact of their choices. A part of him felt anger stirring. Not loud or explosive. Quiet, steady. The kind that came from knowing the truth, while others spoke confidently in error. But fear followed close behind. Who would believe him now? A man in a janitor's uniform claiming deep knowledge of complex agreements? Even if he spoke up, they might laugh. Or worse, call security. He could lose the one thing he had managed to rebuild: stability. He thought about the small apartment he went home to every night, about the regular pay that covered rent and food, about the simple peace he had carved out after years of struggle. Was he ready to risk all of that? As he stood there, his phone vibrated softly in his pocket. He rarely received messages. He pulled it out, half expecting a work alert. Instead, it was an email notification. The subject line made his chest tighten. It was from an old contact, someone he had not spoken to in years. The timing felt unreal, almost cruel. He didn't open it right away. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood still, listening to the low hum of the building. It felt like the past and present were colliding, forcing him to pay attention. Finally, he unlocked his phone again and opened the message. It was short. A simple request to reconnect. A mention of recent events in the industry? No apology. No explanation. Just words that reopened doors he thought were sealed forever. He let out a slow breath. Even after all this time, those connections still existed. Quiet, hidden, but not entirely gone. The boardroom doors down the hall opened briefly. One of the executives stepped out, speaking into a phone, frustration clear in their voice. The janitor turned his back slightly, keeping his eyes down. Old habits. As the door closed again, the voices resumed inside. The meeting was still underway. He realized something then. Fate, coincidence, call it what you will, everything had lined up too perfectly to ignore. He was here. He had heard what he needed to hear. And deep down, he knew silence would stay with him longer than any consequence of speaking out. Memories of the moment. He lost everything came rushing back. The meeting where fingers pointed. The looks that changed instantly from friendly to distant. The quiet walk out of the building for the last time. He had promised himself. He would never let fear make his choices again. Still, his feet remained planted. He needed certainty. Not just memory. Proof. Carefully he walked toward a small staff workstation tucked away near the storage rooms. He logged into the public system used to track room schedules and presentations. He worked slowly, making sure not to draw attention. The file names that appeared made his heart beat faster. The presentation being used in the boardroom was right there, listed under today's date. He hesitated only a moment before opening it. Slide after slide confirmed what he feared. Missing risk factors. Overly hopeful projections. A familiar pattern of cutting corners to meet deadlines and impress investors. And there it was. The clause. Buried deep in the agreement, easy to overlook if you wanted to ignore it. A condition that, if triggered, would collapse the entire plan and expose everything beneath it. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the file. Now he knew. He locked the terminal and stepped back. Heart pounding. This was no longer about old regrets. This was happening again, right now, in front of him. The sounds of the meeting shifted. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. Someone spoke about moving to final approvals. Time was running out. He looked down at his uniform, plain, wrinkled slightly from a long shift. Then he looked back toward the boardroom doors. He was standing at a line he could not cross back from. Not yet, but soon. And when he did, nothing would be the same. He stood there longer than he expected, staring at the boardroom doors as if they might open on their own and invite him in. His heart was still racing from what he had just seen on the screen. Proof had a way of changing everything. Memories were one thing, but documents did not lie. He pushed his cart a few steps forward, then stopped again. People passed at a distance, busy with their own schedules, barely noticing him. That helped. Being invisible had its advantages. Inside the boardroom, the tone of the meeting shifted. It was calmer now, more controlled, the way it got when people believed they were close to agreement. He could hear the low rhythm of confident voices through the thick door. He imagined the final vote taking place, hands going up, smiles appearing, relief spreading around the table. And then, months later, the confusion when things began to fall apart. He had seen that ending before. He leaned against the wall and pressed. His palm flat against the cool surface. His mind tried to talk him out of what he was considering. He reminded himself of his job, his routine, his quiet evenings. He pictured himself at home later, sitting in his small kitchen. Everything still the same. But the image felt wrong now. He couldn't unsee what he knew as he stood there. The door to the boardroom opened again. This time, two people stepped out. One looked frustrated, the other distracted. They talked quickly while walking down the hall, then moved out of sight. The room was smaller now. Fewer decision-makers inside. He took that as a sign, though he wasn't sure from where. He checked the clock on the wall. Minutes felt louder than usual. Every second seemed to push him closer to a choice. He remembered his younger self, sitting across from experienced leaders, nervous but prepared. He had spoken clearly back then. He had believed that calm truth mattered. Somewhere along the way, that belief had been shaken, but not destroyed. He straightened his shoulders, not to look important, just to steady himself. His cart rolled softly as he moved it closer to the door. The sound barely echoed. He stopped just beside the entrance and waited. Voices continued inside, unaware that someone stood only a few feet away, carrying answers they didn't know they needed. His hand hovered near the handle. A final warning rose in his thoughts. "You don't belong here anymore," another voice answered back. "You never stopped belonging." Before he could change his mind, his knuckles tapped the door. The sound was light, almost polite, inside. The voices stopped. For a brief second, nothing happened. Then someone opened the door and looked down at him with confusion. "Yes?" the person asked, clearly surprised. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But I believe there's been an important detail overlooked." Every eye in the room turned toward him. The table fell silent. Some looked annoyed. Others curious. A few barely masked disbelief. A janitor standing at the doorway was not part of the plan. "This isn't the right time," someone said firmly. He nodded once. "I understand, but what's being discussed won't work the way it's presented." That got their attention. Murmurs spread across the table. Chairs shifted. One person stood slightly as if to guide him back out. Another voice spoke up. "On what basis?" He met their gaze. "On the agreement tied to the project you're approving. There's a condition embedded in it that changes the entire outcome if triggered." Silence deepened. Screens were turned. A few people frowned, scanning documents again. "That's not possible," someone said. "This deal has been reviewed thoroughly." He took a slow breath. It was reviewed for profit, not failure. The clause is buried. Page numbers in the double digits. It's easy to miss if you don't expect it. Pause followed. "Who are you?" a voice asked from the far end of the table. He answered calmly. Someone who's seen this exact mistake before. It did not satisfy them, but it unsettled them. One person typed quickly, pulling up files on the main screen. As they scrolled, the energy in the room changed. Confident postures stiffened. Smiles faded. "There," the person said quietly. The clause appeared on the screen. The janitor didn't say anything. He let the room absorb it on its own. Questions began flying. How? Why wasn't this flagged earlier? What did it mean for the timeline? He answered only when asked, keeping his explanations simple. He didn't speak down to anyone. He spoke as someone who understood the language and respected it. One executive studied him closely. "You're not guessing," they said. "You've dealt with this." "Yes," he replied. "Long ago?" Suspicion began replacing irritation. "Why are you here?" Another asked. He glanced at his cart. "I work here." That answer landed heavier than he expected. The room looked at him differently now. Not as a disruption, but as a contradiction to their assumptions. He didn't mention his past. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for him. After several more minutes of tense discussion, someone called for a pause. Phones were checked. Messages were sent. Legal language was revisited with fresh eyes. The decision to move forward was no longer certain. Finally, the chair at the head of the table spoke. "We'll need to reassess before proceeding." Relief and frustration crossed faces at the same time. The janitor nodded. "That's all I hoped for." Someone thanked him quietly. Others just stared. He stepped back toward the door. "Wait," a voice said. "What's your role in all this?" He paused. Then he answered honestly. "Right now? Just making sure the floors stay clean." A few moments later, he was back in the hallway, the door closing softly behind him. The building sounded the same as before. Nothing dramatic had changed on the surface, but for him, everything had. He pushed his cart forward, heart finally slowing, knowing the silence he left behind would speak louder than he ever could. The hallway felt different after he stepped out of the boardroom. Not louder or brighter, just heavier, as if the air itself remembered what had just happened. He pushed his cart slowly, giving himself time to settle. His hands still shook a little, though his face remained calm. He had crossed a line he could not uncross, and now there was no rushing back into the safety of silence. Behind the closed door, voices rose again. Not the confident tone from earlier, but something sharper, more careful. He could hear fragments as he moved awake, Questions, objections, uncertainty. That alone told him he had done the right thing. He stopped near a storage room and leaned the cart against the wall. For a moment, he simply stood there. His body felt tired, older than it had that morning. Speaking the truth always carried a cost, even when it was necessary. As he resumed his work, small moments followed him. A glance from a passing employee that lingered longer than usual, someone slowing down as if they wanted to say something but didn't. Word. It seemed traveled fast. He focused on the simple tasks in front of him. Empty a bin. Straighten a chair. Wipe a counter. These familiar motions kept him grounded while his thoughts raced. What he had not expected was how clearly he felt his old self returning. Not the title or the power, but the sense of responsibility. The quiet confidence that came from understanding consequences before they arrived. About an hour later, a message came through on his phone. A short one, polite. It asked if he could return to the boardroom when available. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Part of him wanted to ignore it. He had already said what needed to be said. Another part knew this was not finished. He cleaned his hands, straightened his uniform, and headed back. This time when he entered, he was met with nods instead of stares. No one smiled, but no one looked down on him either. The room was quieter now, the bright energy replaced by careful attention. Documents were spread everywhere. The presentation had been taken down. Legal language filled the main screen. The person at the head of the table gestured for him to sit. He declined and remained standing near the wall. Questions came one by one. Calm, precise. He answered them the same way. He explained consequences in clear terms, never raising his voice, never pushing blame. At one point, someone asked how he knew so much. He paused. Experience, he said. Nothing more? That answer seemed enough. As the discussion deepened, something else surfaced. A pattern of decisions from the past. Similar shortcuts. Familiar signatures. The janitor recognized the shape of it immediately. He had seen how systems failed when accountability stayed hidden. One executive sat very still, eyes fixed on the table. The tension around them was thick. When they finally looked up, it was with recognition. "You warned us before," he said quietly. The room went still again. He didn't respond right away. "I warned people," he said finally. "They chose speed over caution." No one argued. That was when understanding fully settled in. This was not just about a deal. It was about a culture that decided who mattered and who didn't, who was heard and who was ignored. The meeting stretched longer than planned. Phone calls were placed to outside advisors. Deadlines shifted. Votes were postponed. At the end, the same voice from earlier spoke again. "We're halting approval until this is resolved." There was no debate. As people gathered their things, a few lingered behind. One thanked him openly. Another apologized without going into detail. He accepted both quietly. When he turned to leave, the chair at the head of the table spoke once more. "There may be opportunities we'd like to discuss," they said carefully. He nodded but did not respond. Outside, the sun had climbed higher. The building hummed with midday life. He took a breath and pushed his cart forward again. Returning to his duties felt grounding, but he knew something had changed. Not around him, but within him. That afternoon, memories he thought were buried came back gently instead of crashing in. He remembered why he had chosen that career once. Not for status, but to build things that lasted. As his shift neared its end, he received one more message. This one was longer, respectful. It asked if he would consider sharing more context of what happened. Years ago, he read it twice before putting the phone away. That evening, as he locked his cart in the storage area, he felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, the kind that followed honesty, even when it reopened old wounds. He stepped outside into the evening light. The city looked the same, busy and distant, but he knew the silence inside that boardroom would not fade easily, not this time. The next morning felt quieter than the others. The building woke up the same way it always did. Lights turning on floor by floor, elevators humming, coffee machines starting their steady rhythm. But for him, Nothing felt ordinary anymore. He arrived early, as usual, and began his routine. The work grounded him. It reminded him that real life was built from small actions repeated every day. Still, he noticed things he hadn't before. Doors opened a little wider when he passed. Greetings lasted a second longer. People looked at him not out of surprise now, but curiosity. He did not let it change his pace. By mid-morning, the message he knew would come finally appeared. It was simple and respectful. They wanted to talk. Not in the boardroom this time, but in a smaller space, he agreed. The room they met in had no long table, no screens on the walls. Just chairs in a circle and soft light from a window. It felt intentional, like an attempt to strip away power and speak plainly. They asked him to share his story. Not just what he had noticed, but what had happened years ago. How the warnings were ignored. How responsibility was shifted. How silence had been rewarded, while honesty was pushed aside. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He spoke about systems more than people, about how small compromises added up, about how fear of delay caused bigger failures later. Some listened closely. Others struggled to meet his eyes. When he finished, no one spoke right away. Finally, one person thanked him, not formally, but honestly. Another acknowledged that mistakes had been made. Not quietly this time, but out loud. The company announced changes over the following weeks. Reviews. New safeguards. A pause on projects tied to the old approach. It wasn't perfect. It never was. But it was movement. They offered him a position, not the one he used to have. Not one tied to titles or corner offices. They offered him something quieter but meaningful. A role focused on review, on catching problems early, on asking the hard questions without pressure. He asked for time. That evening, he sat in his small apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through the window. He thought about what he wanted now, not what he had lost. Not what might impress others. He realized something simple. He no longer needed to prove who he was. The next day, he gave them his answer. He accepted, but on his terms. He kept his hours balanced. He kept his distance from unnecessary politics. He stayed focused on purpose, not position. As weeks passed, the building adjusted. Some things changed quickly, others slowly. But conversations were different. People asked questions sooner. Meetings ended with fewer rushed decisions. His cart disappeared from the hallway. But his presence didn't. One evening, as he left the building, he paused at the entrance and looked back at the rows of windows above. Somewhere inside, decisions were being made more thoughtfully than before. He stepped into the evening air and smiled. Faintly. Not because everything had turned out perfectly, but because silence had finally been broken. And this time, it stayed broken. Time passed in a quiet, steady way. Not the kind that rushes forward, but the kind that allows space for reflection. Weeks turned into months, and his new role settled into something routine. Not flashy, not dramatic, just meaningful. He worked from a small office now, one without glass walls or grand views. He liked it that way. People came to him with questions, plans, concerns they might once have ignored. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was careful, grounded, rooted in experience. He noticed how people reacted differently when problems surfaced early. There was less fear, less urgency to hide things. Slowly, trust began to replace tension. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. Some saw him as a reminder of uncomfortable truths. Some avoided him entirely. He expected that. Change rarely pleased everyone. What mattered was that mistakes were no longer being rushed under the surface. One afternoon, a younger employee stopped by his office, nervous, unsure. They asked how he had known. When to speak up, he thought about it before answering. "I didn't," he said honestly. "I just knew when staying quiet would cost more." That answer seemed to stay with them. Outside of work, his life stayed simple. Morning walks. Evenings with books or quiet music. He didn't chase recognition or attention. He had learned how quickly both could disappear. Sometimes he'd walk past the old hallway where he once stood with a cleaning cart. The memory didn't sting anymore. It felt like part of a long road, one that taught him patience.